Another little anecdote. I mean, I can tell this much from the biography. So when he was about 5, he told his nanny that he didn't believe in God or Santa Claus, and he saw the reaction on her face and thought he'd better not say things like that again.
I can't wait. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Total just random nerd question before we start. Have you been able to find an English translation of his PhD thesis? Because I have not been able to find an English translation, and I'm so curious to know what he's written about psychology and education and stuff.
It's not very good, really. Yeah. I mean, okay. he himself wrote it with his left hand, I think, and submitted it quite unfinished. So I wouldn't worry. Die beiden Grundprobleme, the two fundamental problems of knowledge, is such a huge leap beyond anything he's done.
I see.
In the 20s.
The only person on the planet who I could ask that question to, and so I wanted to ask. Well, we are honored and overjoyed to have Professor Brian Boyd from the University of Auckland join us on the podcast today. Brian, welcome.
It's great to meet you, Vaden and Ben.
So just a brief introduction on our side. So Brian Boyd is the leading scholar of evolutionary and biocultural approaches to art, especially literature. That is a little tag I found online that I thought was a nice description of at least part of your work. And so our audience will be familiar with your beautiful book on the origin of stories, evolution, cognition, and fiction, which we dedicated episode 52. I don't think we're going to talk about that too much today, but before I introduce the subject that we will be discussing today, maybe I'll just pass it over to you just to ask for a few words of introduction, what you have worked on in the past and what you're currently working on and thinking about.
From the very start of my academic career, I've worked on Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian-American novelist. Did an essay on him in my undergrad, in my freshman year. Did an MA thesis on him. Thought that was Nabokov done. Found myself choosing another topic for my PhD, but then getting bored with it and going back to Nabokov. And then after finishing that, I was going to do a biobibliography of Nabokov to provide the facts that were missing from Andrew Field's bibliography and biography, and ended up cataloguing Nabokov's Widow's Archive and wrote the 2-volume biography. After that, I was going to put Nabokov away again and work on a book on Shakespeare, but then I got very interested in literature and evolution and art and evolution. So in 1996, I approached Melita Mew, who was Popper's executrix, had been his secretary and kind of family support system in the last 10 years of his life, whether I could do a biography of Popper. To my great surprise, I'd written to Popper in 1986, well before finishing the Nabokov biography, asking if I could do his biography, and I got a reply from Melita Mew, actually, saying that somebody else was working on it, Bartley. And but then I heard in 95, I guess it was, that Bartley had died without having been able to complete much of the book. So I thought, well, this is crazy. I vowed to myself after finishing the Nabokov biography I would never do something so huge again. But I succumbed, and I find that the Popper biography it's not going to be in volume nearly as big as the Nabokov, but in terms of the volume of material I have to deal with, it's about at least 10 times, probably 20 times. So it's
wow.
But anyway, so I started working on the Popper biography in 96, interviewing people, many of whom have died since then. Mm-hmm. But then partly through an online listserv discussion about Nabokov, I got triggered into writing another book on Pale Fire. Nabokov's Pale Fire, which has a subtitle, The Magic of Artistic Discovery, pointing the logic
exactly.
of scientific discovery, as a kind of sop to my conscience for getting a person to work on this biography and then diverging from it almost immediately. But also I was very interested in Popper's evolutionary epistemology, and that got me into thinking that I had a book in my head on literature and evolution, and that I could write it quite quickly. And that was a great mistake. So I thought I could write it in 6 months. It took about 9 years, and then in 2012, I very firmly recommitted myself to finishing the Popper biography, but got a fellowship, another fellowship for it, but various other things, like there was Nabokov's letters to his wife, his uncollected essays and interviews. People approached me to do this with them, or just to do a partial version, and I said, well, I've got all this material, let's do it together. In the second of those cases, and also did an art exhibition with Steven Pinker and a couple of others called Burghers of Art. So that also delayed my getting really into the Popper biography. But now I really do have the materials. I have vastly too much material, really, so it's going to be quite exhausting. I think I probably have let's see, I don't know, about 4 million words in a chronological file.
Holy smoke.
It's insane.
About 450,000 words in one 8-year tranche of his life, So I've got to distill that to about 8 or 10,000 words. So it's going to be grueling. It's going to be so sad to have to leave out all these fascinating detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at least has all been archived and is in a singular place. Yeah. So when we had reached out to you, we had first asked if you would be willing to discuss the life of Karl Popper, and rightly you said you didn't want to be public with that yet, as everything's still being compiled. So we won't be talking too much about Popper's biography, but we will be talking about what Popper could learn from a name who I'm embarrassed to pronounce in front of you, but I will try. Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov.
Very good.
Yeah. I was practicing before this call, actually. So we're going to be talking about these two thinkers because our audience is extremely familiar with Sir Karl Popper. He's been the who we talk about quite a lot, but we don't talk about Vladimir Nabokov almost at all. And I want to begin by reading a passage that you had written in your book of essays, Stalking Nabokov, which resonated with me so strongly and may resonate with some of our listeners as well. And so you write that it can be liberating, but also perhaps limiting to have your mind colonized by somebody else at an early age. If you let it happen, you should make sure that the person whose spell you fall under is someone with a multifaceted genius, like Nabokov, who worked in Russian, English, and French as an artist, a scientist, and even a chess composer of world class. And then you need a corrective, an alternative, someone to expand your mental horizons in a very different direction. And that's what I found in Popper. Again, this is quoting you. And so I'm so fascinated by these two thinkers because they could not be more different in some sense. But as you write, they are both multifaceted geniuses pulling and tugging the mind in alternate directions. And so your biography started with Nabokov and then discovered Popper, but myself and many of our listeners were in the opposite direction. So I think the main subject for today will be what could Karl Popper learn from Vladimir Nabokov? But we also want to kind of introduce Nabokov to our listeners who haven't as much familiarity with him as they do Popper. And so I thought it might be fun just to briefly talk about how each of us have become interested in these two people, because I think all three of us have a different story there. And I'll just give mine quite briefly, which is that when I was younger, I was very influenced by the New Atheists. So Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett. And so if you follow Sam Harris's work, you discover Steven Pinker, and then you keep following that, you discover David Deutsch, and then you discover Deutsch's influence, which is Popper, the philosopher who sits on top. If you do the same thing with Christopher Hitchens, you quickly discover Martin Amis, and then for Martin Amis, you can't read more than an essay of his before you discover Vladimir Nabokov. And so it was kind of pursuing these two intellectual lineages that led me to these two thinkers, which didn't know each other at all. And I rarely talk about Nabokov as much because he's not as podcastable, shall we say. It's not as bite-sized insights that you can turn into podcasts. So that's my backstory and why I'm fascinated by these two thinkers. And maybe just pass it over to Ben, and then obviously to you, Professor, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Probably listeners will be aware of my journey here. I think I was introduced to Popper primarily by Vaden, because trying to debate him is much like trying to debate Vaden without him mentioning Popper after a couple sentences is much like trying to read Amos without him mentioning Nabokov. So yeah, a very similar experience there. And then I figured I might as well go to the source material myself and try and get to these points and stop being surprised by Vaden mid-podcast as we were arguing about Bayesianism or epistemology or whatever it was, politics, etc. And then with Nabokov, I'm a relatively recent convert. I'm not sure how I got into him. I've read Invitation to a Beheading, Lolita, and Pale Fire. But funnily, I find that as I read these books, I tend to have certain opinions and I'll read certain essays about them. And then I've had this experience now multiple times where then I'll read one of your essays, Brian, or your book on that, mentions one of these works. And I'll have the experience of having my mind totally changed about whatever the thesis of the book was or some detail I thought important. So recently I reread Lolita for the second time and found myself getting drawn into the thesis that multiple scholars have posited, that Claire Quilty does not actually exist. This is like a phantom of Humbert Humbert's mind, right? That he's so the ending of the book is sort of a lie, and he's telling this lie to the reader in order to get himself off the hook. And it was only a few days ago that I was reading your essay on Lolita in Stalking Nabokov, where you, in epic fashion, absolutely dismantle this thesis. So much so that I felt absolutely embarrassed for ever being persuaded by it at some point. So, and this has happened to me actually on multiple occasions, thinking that, I found some interesting insight into one of his works, only to read you later and realize, nope, I'm extremely wrong on this point. So that's my current journey.
Well, that's fascinating. So, and interesting how different your two approach to roads to discovery have been.
Mm-hmm.
So, my road of discovery was, I mentioned this in Stalking Nabokov, so it may be familiar to you, but my parents were both left school at 14 in the Depression in Northern Ireland. They knew I had a passion for reading that they couldn't keep up with, so they ended up buying a bookstore and library, which had Lolita in the library, and I snuck it home because they were Puritans, and I snuck it home and read it, hid it under the pillow, and when I was 12 or 13, and it was over my head. But I used to sort out regular magazine orders for our subscribers, and read everything on the way to, as I was sorting. So there was a Time magazine cover story on Nabokov on I think May the 23rd, 1969, on the occasion of the publication of Errata, and there was a little boxed interview there which with a headline in red, "I never met a more lonely, more lucid, mad mind than mine." That caught my attention, of course, and just everything he said seemed so fresh and exciting. So I went to the local public library to get the latest Nabokov book that was available, which was Pale Fire. And this was I was 16 in my last year at high school, and I just read that. And because I'd read the interview, I kind of trusted Nabokov. So there are these cross-references early in the foreword to the novel, as part of the novel, that I followed up. And then if you do that, you lose you don't have enough fingers to stick in all the places because there are so many cross references. But if you do that, after about 20 pages of reading, you know all sorts of secrets that you're not supposed to know at this stage. And it's just so exhilarating. And it's that excitement of discovery that Nabokov builds into his work that still keeps me working on Nabokov, and that I think is the real point of similarity between Nabokov and Popper, the sense that the world is full of endless discovery. So let me just say a little bit more about Nabokov. I mean, he's many writers regard him, and many readers, of course, regard him as perhaps the greatest writer of the 20th century. There are many who don't think, who would say, Nabokov, who's he? Apart from Lolita, perhaps. But I have worked on Homer, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Joyce, and Nabokov is certainly up there with them. Martin Amis, have you mentioned? One of my favorite quotes from him on Nabokov is, he does all the usual things so much better than anybody else. And by that, I think he means, he writes better sentences. He creates more surprising scenes, and yet they're surprisingly right, even though they're totally unexpected. Creates more interesting characters, more interesting plots, more interesting whole structural problems in his novels. And William Deresiewicz, the critic, calls him God's own novelist, which is nice. and another critic calls him probably the greatest and certainly the most complex writer of the 20th century. To talk to the complexity for a moment, I am working diligently on Popper nearly all my time, but since 1993, when I thought I was putting Nabokov away, I realized that I had all these notes related to Errata, his most complex novel that was the focus of my thesis. And I thought some poor sucker is going to have to sweat blood to find all the stuff that I've found in this. Why don't I start releasing notes to a chapter at a time? That became not just a note, but also a little essay explaining the point of that chapter, both for a first-time reader, a kind of forenote, and then an afternote for an expert reader. And that's now online. It's unfinished. I'm up to chapter 57 of 69, and the page count is up to about 2,500 pages and each time I go into a new chapter, having known this novel so intensely, so well for 50 years, I am flabbergasted at what I discover. And yeah.
And so how did you discover Popper? Because Popper is so, at first pass, so completely different than Nabokov. It's interesting that you would have been equally attracted to Sir Karl.
Yeah, well, I used to browse the library shelves in my town and picked up Bertrand Russell when I was at high school, but there was also a bigger bookstore along the street from my parents' bookstore, which had an academic section, and Popper was there, and I was really attracted by both the cover of the Princeton edition of The Open Society and Its Enemies, which has a wonderful photo of Balzac's The Burghers of Calais on it, and also by the comment on the cover of The Logic of Scientific Discovery from Reichenbach, which says, I do not see that the problem of induction is in any way advanced by this book. And so I thought, well, that's and so I was aware of Popper, but I didn't actually read him in a sustained fashion until, I think it wasn't until I was doing my PhD. I was at Canterbury University, where he was between 1937 and 1945. He was back to get yet another honorary degree, and on the occasion of the centenary of the university. And I was going to go to hear him, but he had another of his what he called heart attacks, but they were tachycardiac attacks. They were pretty frightening and debilitating, but so he had to cancel that lecture. He had to have somebody else read it for him. And I remember listening to the lecture and having all sorts of objections to what was being said, because it was read by somebody who was unsympathetic, I think, to the ideas. Now I agree with them all, and kind of think my objections might have been. But no, it wasn't really until I was working on my PhD in writing my dissertation. So I'd been 76. I had an assigned Carol as a dissertation stage PhD student in the University of Toronto Library, and it was through the art history section, and I was working much too hard and kind of like forcing myself to put in the hours, and yet distracting myself by picking up things in the art history section, especially the books of Gombrich. Gombrich was Popper's best friend, and he mentions Popper a bit like Martin Amis mentioning Nabokov. He thinks Popper was not sufficiently appreciated, and I thought I really have to read him in a sustained fashion, and I did, and I was blown away. So,
would you be able to quickly spell the name that you just mentioned? Because I haven't heard that name, and I want to Google it later.
Ernst Gombrich, Gombrich.
Amazing. Thank you. Just wanted to follow up on that briefly.
He wrote a book called The Story of Art, which has gone into 20 editions. His best book probably is Art and Illusion. And he's got lots of wonderful ways of, he was very, very strongly influenced by Popper, in a way that didn't compete with Popper. And Popper perhaps didn't write as much about art as he might have otherwise, because he was very fascinated by music, and he knew literature very well. And to my surprise, as I discovered when I was working on the biography, he also knew visual art very, very well. But he didn't write about that much because he thought Gombrich could do it much better. But
fascinating.
To give you an example of how strongly Gombrich was influenced by Popper, in the tradition of realist art, he says that artists make marks on a surface, and then they try to match it to the idea that they had. So he says making comes before matching, which is a kind of translation into artistic terms of the idea that hypothesis comes before testing. And just all the way through. And Gombrich was also very, very interested in Gestalt psychology and other early cognitive psychology. And Popper was taught Gestalt psychology by Karl Popper in Vienna. Gombrich was, in fact, it is very odd, but Gombrich's father worked for Popper's father as a lawyer in Vienna, but they didn't actually meet except for one insignificant occasion, and it wasn't until they were both in England in 1935-36 that they really got to become friends. And Gombrich was really the person who was instrumental in the publishing of The Open Society and Its Enemies.
So speaking of Popper's interest in art and literature, I believe you've described Nabokov somewhere as someone who loves words and hates ideas, and Popper is precisely the opposite, someone who loves ideas and hates words. I'm wondering if you can just expound on that a bit, and also, do you think Popper and Nabokov would have been friends had they run into each other, or would their personalities have clashed in the most significant of ways?
I think their personalities probably would have clashed. It depends. Both of them could have their welcoming moods and their resistant moods. And if they struck each other in the right frame of mind, they could have gone on very well. They would have discovered how much they shared, even though they came from very, very different starting points. On the other hand, Nabokov was perhaps the most playful of writers, and Popper wasn't playful at all, really. I mean, he was so serious. He focused on problems. Everything was a problem to him. And I think one of the things that perhaps he might have learned if he was in a mood for learning. I mean, he always was ready to learn in the areas that interested him, but in this respect, I'm not so sure he would have been. But not to focus on everything as a problem, or put it in another way, when you're addressing other people, not to focus only on an intellectual problem, but to see the problem as one of engaging the other person. And Nabokov used to do that through humor, through kidding around with people. It certainly wasn't Popper's way. Yeah, but both of them were interested in problems. Like you mentioned chess problem composition in when you were quoting me. So Nabokov would find relief from writing a very complicated book by creating a very complicated chess problem, which had some of the same bizarre teasing qualities that his fiction have. And Popper, on the other hand, also says some things about play which are very interesting. He doesn't say much about play, but clearly he felt that childhood was a time of discovery through play, through adventure, and he always talked about the adventure of ideas, which is very, very close to Nabokov. The adventures of literary structure was the focus, as he said, for his lectures at Cornell and Harvard.
Fascinating.
So yeah, Popper thought that language probably emerged through play, through children vocalizing in playful ways, which is an interesting idea. I mean, both of them were just endless sources of inventiveness in different ways.
Yeah, it strikes me as we're talking, perhaps you want to just say a few words about Nabokov's career as a scientist. I mean, I think this is probably operating in the background for all three of us, but the audience might not know that he spent a significant amount of time studying butterflies, of all things. And so perhaps you just want to speak to his career as something other than a writer, and just touch on the various things that he
Okay, so as a very young child, he was already telling stories to himself, and he was also calculating. He seemed to have a real maths fixation when he was 5 or 6, and then he had an illness, and he lost that maths fixation. Oliver Sacks knows my work and is just fascinated by these various aspects of Nabokov's psyche. Instead of maths, he switched to butterflies. And by the age of 9, he knew all the butterflies of Europe. By the age of 10, he knew all the butterflies of the world. And he had a passion. He wanted to discover new species. He didn't, in fact. I mean, he did think he had, and wrote off to a Russian entomological journal and got a snary response. But let's see, when the family left Leningrad, as it was by then, in 1917, they went to the Crimea first, where Nabokov caught lots of new butterflies and wrote it up, and was published while he was an undergraduate at Cambridge. And then when he got a little bit of money for one of his books in the late 20s, he went on a holiday to the Pyrenees and researched there. And then wrote that up, and it got published in the same in the Entomologist in Britain. And then in the 1940s, when he arrived in America, he had to teach at Stanford, and he was teaching a Russian language student in New York who offered to drive him. They didn't have a car across the U.S. and in the Grand Canyon, he discovered what seemed to be a new species, and so he wrote that up. He was working in the American Museum of Natural History to try and identify its congeners. And then in 1941, he got a position at Wellesley College in Boston, and at the same time managed to get himself a position as basically the curator of Lepidoptera at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. So he was reclassifying all their saved specimens, but at the same time he was going on expeditions across America in the summers and discovered quite a few new species. But it's interesting that people thought he was an amateur. I mean, he was an amateur, and he got a little bit of research fellowship from his Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology routine, but it wasn't. He was still teaching and writing at the same time. But it wasn't until the late 1980s that people started working in the Latin American blues, which he had reclassified in a paper in 1945. And they're just blown away by the fact that he had entirely reclassified the genera in the Lycaenids, which is particularly rich and complicated genus, or superfamily, actually. They started naming butterflies after Nabokov. So there is a Lolita, there's a Humbert, there's a Charlotte, and they. I got to know these people, and they asked me to suggest the names and other Nabokov scholars. So that was fun, and they've written a book called Nabokov's Blues, the scientific adventures of a literary genius, where they have a very, very high respect for him. The woman who runs or did for a time, the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology was a lepidopterist, a wonderful lepidopterist, Naomi Pierce, was going to do an exhibition on Nabokov, and she thought he was a bit of an amateur until she started looking at his work and realizing how fertile it was. And she and one of her students did a study that Nabokov, in one of his articles, just says, imagine we had a Wellesian time machine and we can go back several million years. And he started to suggest how the Americas were populated by Lycaenids across the Bering Strait. And he suggested several waves. He suggested the time it might have been, and all of these things. He had no solid evidence, but it all worked out. And there were things that they couldn't possibly have tested back in the days when he was proposing it, but they were able to test it all, and it all panned out. And people are just blown away by his insights.
I think I remember reading this, perhaps from you, but maybe from someone else, that within the field of lepidoptery, people saw him as a serious scientist with a bit of a writing hobby. And then within the field of literature, they saw him as a serious writer with a bit of a butterfly hobby, and not really fully appreciating that he's making fundamental contributions to both fields and not telling the other communities about them. So that is accurate, I guess. Yeah. And I guess my question is, how do you think his love of butterflies influenced his literature?
Let me tell you, answer this by a little anecdote. I was interviewing Harry Levine, who was one of the top literary critics of the last century and a friend of Nabokov's. And he said, what especially interests you in Nabokov? And I said, I was a bit thrown back, or I would have said perhaps everything, But I said, well, perhaps his philosophy. And he laughed and he said, he doesn't have a philosophy. And yet that's one of the things I've been working on most. And he mentions philosophers from, I've got a list here of Heraclitus, Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Descartes, Spinoza, Berkeley, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Bergson, Whitehead, and Wittgenstein in his fiction. But to get back to the question of what in his interest in lepidopterology connects with literature, and I think it's partly his epistemology, his sense that there's endless discoveries to be made in butterflies, in any aspect of nature that you start to get an interest in, and he tries to build in something of the same excitement of discovery that he found in dealing with nature in his literary art, so that he has problems of just a little echo in a phrase later in a novel will trigger something. Now, I've heard something like that before. Where was that? And you go back, and these little puzzles lead into bigger puzzles, into deeper and deeper puzzles, so that if you get to the very, what seems to me anyway, to what has seemed to me to be the very bottom of some of these puzzles, there's a whole other story going on in the novel, a whole different metaphysical level. So there's that excitement of discovery. I think there's also the precision that he feels is crucial for a natural scientist. The attention to detail, his novel, his eye for detail is astonishing, and his eye for not just a kind of accumulation of detail, but a kind of refreshing detail that catches you by surprise, and often is rendered through a metaphor or some kind of imaginative twist, so you really sense it.
Yeah, no, that's so fascinating. I believe in your book on Pale Fire, you describe how his love of chess puzzles influences his fiction, in the sense that with a chess puzzle, you are confused, and then light bulb, it clicks, and there's no more ambiguity about if you've resolved that or not, and there's a explosion of clarity, I guess. And so when you're describing the puzzles that he puts into Pale Fire, but obviously throughout the body of his work, that's the pleasure that awaits the reader, is to have that explosion of clarity. And that's just why Pale Fire is one of my favorite books, because of that the very phenomenon. But so back to the connection and the relationship between Popper and Nabokov. So one thing that Popper would never, ever do is employ the device of the unreliable narrator. That is antithetical to Popper's entire being. And so if you want to know what Popper thinks about philosophy or about linguistics, he will tell you in an essay. However, with Nabokov, that is not the case. With Nabokov, you have to hunt and peek, and you have to start piecing this together. And so I would just love to hear from your perspective, if Nabokov was to write an essay about his epistemology or about his philosophy, what would it be? How could we distill that information in kind of a Popperian, clear way? Or maybe that question doesn't even work because his philosophy doesn't lend itself to that kind of analysis. But I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Well, he actually has done something like that in an essay called The Creative Reader.
Okay, excellent. Okay.
On the one hand, he senses that there's an incredible mystery in things, and he doesn't want to dispel things. And Popper is very aware of how much we don't know, but he doesn't see it really in terms of mysteries so much as in terms of possible, ongoing discovery. But Nabokov thinks there is a kind of metaphysical mystery behind things, and he doesn't want to spill the secret. He wants to dangle it in front of the reader in this essay. And at the same time, he also thinks that the imagination is so central. The imagination is very central for Popper too, in a different kind of way. But in fact, that's perhaps something we can come back to. Popper's sense of the importance of creativity in science and in art. But because he thinks imagination is so crucial, when he's writing a prose essay, he compensates for the fact that he's not writing fiction by overdosing with images. So it's just a cascade of images, and it's almost overwhelming. So it's hard to get a kind of linear sense of either a metaphysical or an epistemological argument in Popper. I mean, in Nabokov. So yeah.
Okay, so this next question, I'm slightly afraid to ask it in front of two Nabokov fanatics, but let me do my best. So I think that when I first read Nabokov, there was this sense that he's a master of the literary puzzle in some sense, and in Pale Fire, for instance, this is on full display, and what you're doing as the reader is you're trying to unravel this mystery that he's laid for you, and he does this perhaps more masterfully than any writer ever has. But I think a lot of people leave their journey from Pale Fire thinking that's sort of all there was there. He's a writer that is focused on puzzles and laying puzzles for the reader for them to discover. And as intricate as these puzzles are, they are sort of puzzles at the end of the day. But my sense of reading you write about Nabokov is he's not simply a puzzle maker, right? He is dealing with very substantive, deep ideas still in his books. He's doing both of these things, and if you're not careful as the reader, you can only analyze him as this sort of puzzle maker. So I'm wondering if you what you think about that, and if you'd like to rebut someone or me making that thesis.
Well, to take Pale Fire for instance, it is very full of literary puzzles, and they're quite they're thrown in your face. On the other hand, the poem around which the novel is constructed has it at its center the poet's, the invented poet's description of the night his daughter committed suicide. And I've read this poem to people in a kitchen in Toronto, in a bus in Russia, and the audience has tears. He has very, very powerful emotions, and I mean, people know about the intensity of Hamlet's passion for Lolita, but emotional intensity is all the way through all his fiction. So there's always that. I mean, I think he stresses the importance of the emotions, the imagination, the intellect, all of them, and the senses. So. But he's also, yes, convinced, I'm not convinced, but he wants to probe the mystery of what lies behind things. And, I mean, he has a sense of a kind of designing consciousness, which and of consciousness as being the primary thing in the universe, in a sense. So he was brought up in an era when that kind of idealism was perhaps rampant in philosophy, and now, of course, it's very much the other way. It's very much materialist. But Popper was always strongly anti-idealist, even though he felt that his executrix, whom I've mentioned, told me that he said, "Well, if there's a God, I'll find out when I die." I mean, but another little anecdote. I mean, I can tell this much from the biography. So when he was about 5, he told his nanny that he didn't believe in God or Santa Claus, and he saw the reaction on her face and thought he'd better not say things like that again.
That is so fat. I've always wondered why Popper never wrote about religion, because his like falsifiability obviously applies so clearly to the religious argument, but he never wrote about it, and so that's fascinating. Yeah,
it's also funny that despite going through his career with many other philosophers and academics constantly yelling at him, it was really the look by his nanny that got him to stop talking about a certain subject. Like that's really what it was. Yeah. Good thing she hadn't had that look on her face when mentioning, that all philosophy is puzzles or just word games or something. Then Popper could have turned out quite differently. Okay. So my next question is about this topic that some people call like the death of the author, and Vaden and I have debated this a bit. To simplify things horribly, there are maybe 2 camps of people who are reading a fictional book. One might be investigating the message as they believe the author wanted to convey it. So there's like a truth to the matter, and that truth depends on the author's subjective notions of what the book was about. And then the alternate camp might say, actually, the author's intentions don't matter much. What matters is like the word on the page. And we can analyze a book, an essay, etc., regardless of maybe what the author has said about it afterwards, or regardless of how even they thought they felt about it. And we can just analyze the words and then debate what the meaning was there. And I'm wondering if you come down clearly in one of those camps. My sense is not from maybe the comments I made earlier about Lolita, where some of the evidence you bring to bear against the thesis that I mentioned earlier, that Claire Quilty doesn't exist, is precisely that Nabokov makes mistakes with dates quite often, right? But you can imagine someone saying, that doesn't matter. He wrote, there's certain dates in the book, and these dates don't line up, and therefore we have to take this sort of discrepancy seriously. And that's my positive argument for why Claire Quilty doesn't exist. But yeah, so you seem to take the opposite sort of vantage point with respect to that example. But obviously, the subtitle of your book on Pale Fire is the magic of artistic discovery, meaning there's something on the page to truly discover, presumably somewhat independently of the author's intentions. So yeah, I'm just curious.
Well, I feel I'm inspired by Nabokov's intentions, rather than making my discoveries independent of Nabokov. I think he's laid trails there that you're willing to, if you're willing to follow, can take you a long way deeper into the book. And I do the same with Shakespeare. Say again, perhaps it's a Popperian in me. Popper, talks about problems and trying to understand the problem situation of a thinker or a scientist. And I think that's what I try to do in my work on Nabokov or on Shakespeare, say. Like in Shakespeare, trying to understand how we know the sources for most of his plays, how he sees the problem of translating that source, which is usually a very bland prose narrative, into something that works on the stage. And by following that, by going deeper and deeper into the problem, you get a sense of just how exciting was what he discovered. So for me, I'm interested in trying to discover why writers write to prompt readers to respond in certain ways and within a certain range of ways, And I think it becomes much more interesting if we don't just throw out our first subjective response, but we think, what in the text is prompting me to respond, and is there something else in the text that complicates that response? So it's almost like, and Popper hasn't had a great influence on literary studies, but there are a few literary Popperians who talk about reading this process of, hypothesizing about a book and then testing it against the rest of the book, or it could be against comments by the author outside. But I think most people would stress that it's really the contents of the book that are because an author writing a literary work tries to make everything self-contained in a way that you can't with a scientific theory. So the relevant evidence should be there in the text. And so part of the fun of it is finding how things that seem to be unrelated in the book are actually related. That one of them will answer a problem or a hypothesis that you have, an interpretation that you have about reading, and perhaps deepen the hypothesis or, throw it over.
So just one follow-up on that. I'm curious if you view the best fiction as perhaps lending itself, after, much hypothesizing and stuff, to sort of one correct reading, one true reading. And like, obviously you have a very specific thesis about what actually happened in Pale Fire, for instance. And I'm wondering if, is it reasonable to read a text and then ascribe multiple meanings to it? Or do you think the best work actually at the end of the day, and it might be very hard to figure out what the true meaning is, but sort of has like one truer or truest interpretation?
Well, I think authors are aware that anything they write is going to be taken lots of different ways. They will want readers to respond within a certain range. They realize that range could be very, very wide. And one way of limiting the range of response is to be over emphatic, to state your position too bluntly, and that will probably turn most readers off. So in order to interest them, you've got to you've got to be subtle and imaginative about it, and expect that the more life you capture in your fiction, the more varied the response is going to be. Just as there are, when you see an incident, there are going to be many different perspectives on that incident, and many different emotional responses to the incident. If you tell a complicated story, it's bound to have a whole range of responses. Tolstoy is an interesting case in point. He had very strong views about everything, but at the same time, in his greatest work like Anna Karenina, there's a whole. He sympathizes with Anna, even though morally he disapproves of her, in such a way that there's a whole range of responses. After writing that, he felt that writing fiction was almost sinful. He was starting to go through his religious phase, and started writing little parables that anybody could understand, little animal fables, with morals made explicit, which is so different from the kind of intense, open-ended realism that he has in his fiction. Nabokov always, when he talked about Tolstoy, he said it's a pity you couldn't kick him off his soapbox and get him back to writing about the way the hair on it curls and Anna Karenina on his neck.
So, being conscientious of the time, we're approaching the hour mark. But in our email exchange leading up to this conversation, you had said that you have a strange set of conjectures, which could make some inroads on the question as to what Popper, whose interests were so wide and desire to learn so strong, might have been able to learn from Nabokov. You had mentioned one of those already, which is the value of playfulness. And perhaps one of the major similarities between the two thinkers is their love of creativity and imagination. And I guess I just want to make sure that you didn't have any more to say on that particular subject before we wind down. So playfulness, would you say that's key, or would you say that's one of many different things that Popper could have learned from?
Well, I think you mentioned earlier, you brought up the question of the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
Popper had a very kind of literalist reading of fiction. Brian McGee, I don't know if you know his, was a close friend of Popper's for a long time and was a novelist as well as many, many other things. And when he gave Popper his novels, Popper would be disapproving of the central character's behavior as if it were McGee's confession. And McGee was flabbergasted. So,
that's fascinating. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And Popper had a sense that most of modern art was vitiated by expressionism. That the sense that he went back as far as Beethoven. I mean, he revered Beethoven on the one hand, but he also felt that his expressionistic theory of art was a disaster. And this idea that the artist is trying to express his passions and so on, he felt that anything we do automatically expresses it's a triviality. And what was of interest to him was the creator, the artist of any kind, posing himself or herself a problem that the interaction between the artist and the work allowed the artist to transcend himself, who was always himself in his days, allowed an artist to take them beyond themselves. And that was a very strong sense of his relationship to his own work, or to any scientist too, that somehow we lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps, we become better than we are. And I think Nabokov was also of the same persuasion in a way. I mean, I don't know if you're aware that he refused to, after a while, when he was famous enough to set the conditions for an interview, he would ask for questions in advance, and he would write out answers in advance. He felt that the gap between what he could say spontaneously and what he could write was so enormous. He wanted to be. He felt that he wanted to be assessed on the utmost he could do with words, and so there's another interesting connection between Popper and Nabokov. Popper always liked to, he felt criticism was essential to his thinking. Criticism allows you to realize that you may not know quite as much as you do know, and go looking for more. So for him, criticism is not something negative, but it's an inspiration to further creativity, further discovery. And so falsification for him is, it is not a gotcha, a way of negating things, but it's a way of prompting you to look further. And Nabokov, I think, was, as a writer, was very, very much the same, that he felt that he used to, for his last 30 years anyway, he wrote with pencils. And he was proud of the fact that he always pencils with an eraser on the end. He was proud of the fact that he tended to use out the eraser before he used up the lead. Yeah, because he was revising so much. And Popper, of course, was an incessant reviser. So when he went to give a talk, he would be up the whole night. I mean, he would do it well in advance, but then he'd be up the whole night before he delivered it. And in the cab on the way to the lecture hall, he would be revising it again, and of course, after it was given, he'd be revising it again before publication. The logic of scientific discovery has about 10 editions in German and 8 in English and 20 appendices.
Open Society was rewritten like 20 times or something too, wasn't it?
He used to drive his research assistants crazy by the fact of his incessant revisions, which often they felt didn't improve things necessarily. So, but to get back to the point, the question you asked, so I think Nabokov just might have been able to explain to Popper that when writers or other artists were doing something that was complicated and demanding, it was not necessarily because they were trying to be pretentious, he was always for simplicity and clarity, but because they were setting themselves new problems that would lead to different kinds of discovery. And I think, Nabokov too was unimpressed by a lot of the conventionalism of modern avant-garde art. Not so they were very similar in that respect, but on the other hand, he valued very much writers like Joyce or Proust who were doing completely new things with fiction. There seems to be one reference that Popper knew Kafka's work and liked it, but that surprises me. But this was a Kafka scholar who said this, who was a friend of Popper's. But other than that, he's just not responsive to demanding 20th century fiction. He likes kind of middle-brow stuff at best. Whereas I think Nabokov could have said, well, think of it as writers posing new kinds of problems, deeper kinds of problems, rather than trying to show how up to date. There are certain writers who I think brilliant writers who are vitiated a little by their desire to be avant-garde. I think Samuel Beckett is just a wonderful writer, but I think some of the stuff is flawed in the fact that he wants to be. He wants to eliminate more, as he thinks abstract art, visual art, eliminates things, and I don't think that actually made his work richer.
Yeah, I'm just curious, quickly, if you wish you had been able to meet Nabokov in person, or if you feel like that maybe would have changed how you viewed his work, or if there's a regret there, or if it's sort of not a huge deal.
He actually did read my MA thesis. I sent it to him. Yes, and his wife sent back. She was handling all the correspondence. She sent back some very complimentary remarks, but he's got crosses in beside a couple of mistakes, which is lovely to have. But
must have been the scariest letter to receive.
Yeah, I would have been daunted to meet him, I think, before I sorted out my ideas for the PhD, and then I think I would have been very pleased to meet him, and I think he would have been. His wife was very thrilled with what I wrote, and kept the biography by her bedside in her last years of life. Alfred Appel, who was a student of Nabokov's at Cornell, wrote the annotated Lolita, and also Nabokov's Dark Cinema, became a friend of Nabokov's some time after his university years. And he was a kind of irrepressible wag. When I was sitting with him in a conference near the front, he'd be whispering jokes in response to what was being said, and it was very hard to keep a straight face. But he said Nabokov was the most fun person to be with that he'd ever met. Which is not how some people took them.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a very brief remark for listeners that I realized we didn't say at the beginning of the show, but I think Vladimir Nabokov and his wife Vera felt sort of burned by a subpar biography that was written about him during his life. And so after he passed away, Vera was obviously very careful with all his writings and didn't want to just share them with anyone. And we should just point out that she was so impressed with both your MA and PhD thesis that, she invited you to come to their place in Montreux, I believe, where you went and spent, I think, several years with her. Correct me if I'm wrong, just going through his archives and stuff. And so I just want the listeners to be aware that the quality of your scholarship on Nabokov is, surpasses everyone and has reached such extents that his wife felt comfortable sharing everything he had written with you. So I just wanted to add that detail.
Thousands of pages of his writing would not be public had it not been for your work. So his lectures on literature, I believe you had discovered, as well as the compilation of essays in Think, Write, Speak, correct me if I'm getting some of the details wrong. Not to mention some of the Russian poems and stuff. So just a huge thank you for your tireless work here, because I wouldn't have read nearly as much about him had it not been for your fine touch. But we are past the hour mark, so I guess this is an excellent place to say thank you, both for this conversation and for all of the work that you've done and are currently doing. And I typically don't get excited for like when new TV shows are going to come, but I am so excited for the book that you are currently writing. And so when it's finally released, even if it takes another 30 years, I will wait, and I cannot wait to read what is about to come out. Yeah. So thank you, Professor. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, thanks very much.